While not one of the original 7 kingdoms of the Dwarves, it would become one of their most prosperous. While its history with Smaug is well known, there was a time long before when the Dwarves willingly abandoned this very kingdom. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the history of Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain. While the Lonely Mountain wouldn't become a kingdom until well into the Third Age, we know that the Dwarves of Durin's folk had control over the mountain during the early Second Age at the latest. They also had control of the nearby Iron Hills as an additional settlement of their people. The mountain would take on a much more important role after the fall of Khazad-dûm to the Balrog in 1981 of the Third Age. With both Durin VI and his son Nain I killed by the Balrog, the kingship of Durin's folk passes to Thrain I. Thrain leads a group of his people in their exile from Moria to the Lonely Mountain. There, the dwarves dig halls and caves in order to create an underground city. Thus, the kingdom under the mountain is born in 1999 of the Third Age. As Thrain I rules his people as the first king under the mountain, the dwarves discover riches within the rock, including the Arkenstone. The increasing wealth of Erebor leads men to found their own settlement between the slopes of the mountain. Thrain I dies in 2190 of the Third Age, passing the kingship to his son, Thorin I. Now real quick, it's important to note these are not the Thrain and Thorin of the Hobbit tale. Those dwarves are the second of their names, whereas these are the first. Thorin I would rule as king under the mountain for 20 years, before making a huge decision for his people. They would abandon the Lonely Mountain. In the aftermath of Khazad-dûm's fall, Erebor was not the only location the dwarves fled to. Most notably, a great number of dwarves settled in the arid Mithrin, the Grey Mountains north of Mirkwood. Thorin I hoped to reunite Durin's folk, as well as take advantage of the mountains themselves, which were largely unexplored and richer for mining. They leave Erebor, which would remain a much smaller settlement for the dwarves, and make their way to the arid Mithrin. For well over 300 years, the dwarves of Durin's folk would prosper in their capital, now in the Grey Mountains. However, a great and terrible threat would come, one that would plague them for many long years: dragons. As Tolkien says in Appendix A, but there were dragons in the wastes beyond, and after many years they became strong again, and multiplied, and they made war on the dwarves, and plundered their works. In 2570 of the Third Age, the dragons from the northern waste make war upon the dwarves. What is notable is that for 20 long years, the dwarves would hold out against this mighty foe. Like the dwarves of the First Age fighting against the dragons of Morgoth, the dwarves show it is possible to withstand such a mighty foe for a time. However, in 2589, the dragons attack the very halls of King Dain I. Both the king and his second son are killed by a great cold drake, that is, a dragon that cannot breathe fire. With the death of the king, most of the dwarves abandon the Grey Mountains in the following year. The kingship is now passed to Thror, the grandfather of Thorin II, Oakenshield. He leads his people back to Erebor with the Arkenstone in hand, re-establishing the kingdom under the mountain. Thror's younger brother, Gror, leads another group to the nearby Iron Hills, establishing a lordship for this long-held dwarven settlement. Erebor once again becomes the capital of Durin's folk, and over the next 200 years, the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain would become the greatest smiths in Wilderland. Both Erebor and the Iron Hills would prosper greatly, as would their closest neighbor. The settlement of men in the valley of the mountain would become a great city, the city of Dale. The men of Dale and the dwarves of Erebor would have a great friendship, and both would prosper greatly in the years to come. However, this would not last. A familiar foe would come to wreak havoc upon the people of this land: a dragon. This was not any mere dragon, it was Smaug, the greatest fire-breathing dragon of all the Third Age. Smaug had heard of the wealth of Erebor, and in his lust for riches, one night in 2770, he descends upon the lonely mountain, bringing fire and death. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods, they all went up in fire. By that time, all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. The river rushed up in steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. With the warriors of both dwarves and men mostly destroyed, Smaug returns to Erebor, routing the remaining dwarves and driving out any survivors. We are told Smaug then amasses a pile of gold within the mountain, which is now his. The kingdom under the mountain is no more, and the dwarves are once again exiled. All told, the death toll of the sack of Erebor is in the thousands. Most of the dwarven survivors escape to the Iron Hills, joining Gror's people. Thror, his son Thrain II, and grandson Thorin II would lead the others in their exile. These wanderings would lead to Thror's death and a war with the orcs of the Misty Mountains, before Thrain leads his people to settle in the Blue Mountains west of the Shire. As for Smaug, he would only occasionally exit the mountain over the next 2 centuries to feed. We are told he would carry away people, especially maidens of Dale, to eat, as well as continue his destruction of the city. This leads to the total abandonment of Dale, with the survivors living in Esgaroth upon the Long Lake, also known as Lake Town. Their former home and the lands around both Erebor and Dale come to be known as the Desolation of Smaug. And there was neither brush nor tree, and only broken and blackened stumps to speak of the ones long vanished. This would of course not be the end of Erebor, however. With the help of the wizard Gandalf, Thorin II Oakenshield, now king of his people, organizes the Quest of Erebor, an effort to reclaim their homeland. For his part, Gandalf knew that Smaug would almost certainly ally with a resurgent Sauron and cause mass destruction in the north of Middle-earth. The company would of course come to Erebor itself after many adventures. During their time in Erebor, we learn that the southwestern spur of the mountain contains a dwarven guard post called Ravenhill, where the birds of its namesake dwelt, and from which they would carry messages for the dwarves. We also learn of the Back Door, a secret entrance on the western side of the mountain, which led to the bottommost cellar of the dwarven halls. Similar to the west gate of Moria, this door was invisible from the outside, though this door would only become noticeable with the setting sun, or the last light, of Durin's Day, which would shine upon the keyhole. This door would not only lead Bilbo and Thorin's company into the mountain, but it was also the way that Thror and Thrain had escaped Smaug's attack. After learning that Bilbo must have been helped by the Lakemen, Smaug leaves the mountain seeking to destroy them. He comes in a reckless rage, taking no heed of any that may resist him, but seeking only to set the town ablaze. In this moment, Bard the Bowman, ancestor of Lord Girion of Dale, turns to his black arrow. The dragon swooped once more, lower than ever, and as he turned and dived down, his belly glittered white with sparkling fires of gems in the moon, but not in one place. The great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight from the string, straight for the hollow by the left breast, where the foreleg was flung wide. In it smote and vanished, barb, shaft, and feather. So fierce was its flight. With a shriek that deafened men, felled trees, and split stone, Smaug shot spouting into the air, turned over, and crashed down from on high in ruin. Full on the town he fell. His last throws splintered it to sparks and gleeds. And that was the end of Smaug and Esgaroth. With the death of the dragon, Thorin and his company retake Erebor and the treasure within. He is now officially king under the mountain, and the Lonely Mountain belongs to the dwarves once more. However, the peace would be short-lived. Thorin succumbs to dragon sickness, an immense greed brought on by treasure upon which a dragon has long brooded. In his sickness, Thorin refuses to give any of the reclaimed treasure in compensation for the destroyed lake town. Along with the elves of Mirkwood, the men place Erebor under siege. The conflict nearly becomes a full-on battle with the arrival of Thorin's cousin, Dane Ironfoot, now Lord of the Iron Hills. However, Gandalf intercedes and warns that goblins and wargs from the Misty Mountains and Grey Mountains are marching upon them. Agreeing that the orcs are the enemies of all, the elves, men, and dwarves join forces, and the battle of 5 armies begins. The goblins, wargs, and bats would be defeated in the end, thanks in large part to the late arriving Great Eagles and Beorn. However, Thorin and his sister sons and heirs, Kili and Fili, would die from the battle. Dane Ironfoot takes up the kingship of Doran's folk, and over the coming decades, would return Erebor to its lost glory. In addition to returning wealth and prosperity, they would build great towers upon the mountain itself and dig roads deep underground. With the returning prosperity of the dwarves comes the returning prosperity of their mannish neighbors. Dale is re-established as its own kingdom, with Bard himself becoming its first ever king. The men would commonly be known as Bardings, in affection for their first ruler. Despite the renewed glory of their realms, both dwarves and men would face a new threat with the coming War of the Ring. In 3018 of the Third Age, an emissary from Sauron comes to Dane, seeking the location of Bilbo and his ring. Dane turns the messenger away and sends Glóin and Gimli to Rivendell to warn Bilbo that Sauron was seeking him. Months later, King Brand, the grandson of Bard, holds an invading army of Easterlings at the river Carnan for a time, but is eventually driven back. And on March 14, 3019, the Battle of Dale begins. A combined force of men and dwarves march out to meet the Easterlings at the feet of the mountain. For 3 days, the armies take part in bloody, close-quarters combat. On March 17th, King Brand is killed, and Dane fights to his last breath, defending the body of his friend. With their king slain, the men and dwarves retreat into the mountain. Led now by their princes, Bard II and Thorin III Stonehelm, they withstand the ensuing siege of Erebor. For 10 days, they are made to hold out against Sauron's northern army. On the 8th day, March 25th, the One Ring is destroyed, along with Sauron's southern forces. Seeing the morale of their foes fall with the news from the south, Thorin and Bard lift the siege on March 27th, driving the Easterlings out of Dale and back to Rhûn. With the victory, Thorin Stonehelm is officially crowned the 6th Dwarven King under the mountain, and Bard II becomes King of Dale. They each send ambassadors to the coronation of King Aragorn Elessar, and would remain in friendship with Gondor. From that moment onward, both Erebor and Dale would fall under the protection of the High King of the reunited kingdom. We are told that both realms would continue to prosper well into the Fourth Age, even after Khazad-dûm is reclaimed by Durin VII, sometime after the year 171. Finally free from the threat of dragons and Sauron, Erebor and Dale are left to prosper in both wealth and friendship. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Kella Brimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mobs Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Sidgman Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Mookie the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, Grant McGregor, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.